Hello everyone, I'm Sean Carroll and welcome to this special bonus video in which I try to shamelessly convince you to become a Patreon supporter of the Mindscape podcast. The podcast itself, which is not video, it's just audio, as you probably know, is available for free and always will be. You can always listen to it. You don't have to pay anything. But if you become a Patreon supporter, you get a couple of extra goodies, the most obvious ones of which are you get to have an ad-free version of the podcast, and also you get to contribute the questions that I tackle in the monthly Ask Me Anything episodes. There's also some sort of more vague, intangible benefit of supporting a good cause and being part of the conversation that goes on in the comment sections, etc. This video illustrates one more little benefit that we're experimenting with. I think it's going to go forward, but we'll see how it is, which is a reflection video that I do after each podcast. So the podcasts are audio, but after each podcast, I'll do just a couple minutes of reflection in which I say a little bit about why I chose this person or what I thought about the conversation or other places to go and so forth. Nothing very deep, but a little bit of reflection on the podcast that just happened. So this is an example, just to whet your appetite, freely available this one, but the other ones you got to go to Patreon. For $1 an episode, $4 a month, something like that, you get this wonderful little bit of extra content. So this is the reflection video associated with the podcast I did with Tim Maudlin, who's a philosopher of science and expert in the foundations of quantum mechanics. It was great to have Tim Maudlin on the podcast at last. I've been meaning to have Tim on for a long time. Tim is clearly one of the world's leading philosophers of physics, a worker, a researcher in foundations of quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, arrow of time, all these things that I care about a lot. For those of you who are not in the community, there's a very, very active, tight-knit group of philosophers of physics in the New York, New Jersey area between Rutgers, NYU, and Columbia, especially with at Rutgers, Barry Lower, who we've had on the podcast, also people like Shelley Goldstein. At NYU, Tim used to be at Rutgers, then he moved to NYU, and then David Albert, of course, at Columbia. They all interact with each other, talk with each other all the time. The great thing about Tim is he's super duper smart, always worth talking to, and I disagree with him about just about everything when it comes to the philosophy of physics, but he's still very worthwhile talking to. Happily, in the podcast, we actually mostly dwelled on things that I agree with him about in terms of why it's so important to think about the foundations of physics and so forth. He's a tireless advocate for the position of foundations within the intellectual spheres that we move in, so it was wonderful to get that aspect of his thought represented. When it comes to quantum mechanics, of course, I was happy to get the pro-Bohmian point of view, which we've not had on the podcast before. We didn't talk that much about his objections to Everettian quantum mechanics, but they're similar to other people who have reasonable objections to Everett. Whenever I give my talks about many worlds, I try to distinguish between objections to many worlds that are just misunderstandings or not very coherent versus objections that are actually, puzzles that are reasonable to fret about. We don't know what the final answers are. Some theories are going to be more promising for some reasons, less promising for others, and every individual researcher is going to balance what they really care about. And I think Tim and I are a great pair in the sense that we do very much disagree for reasons that are interesting rather than just because he doesn't understand it. I mean, as he says in the podcast, he would count Everett as a perfectly respectable try at the foundations of quantum mechanics. He just doesn't think it works, mostly for reasons about, getting the probability rule right and getting structure out of the wave function, mapping it onto experience, things like that. And these are very good things to worry about. I think that we can answer those worries, but those are the good worries that he has. It's interesting because it reveals a difference in how people come to these things. I prefer to have a theory that is super duper simple from which in principle I can derive complicated things rather than going all the way to a theory that just adheres very closely to the phenomena. Bohmian advocates like it because, why does quantum mechanics sometimes have electrons acting like particles, sometimes like waves? Because there are both particles and waves. I remember about a year ago, Tim and I both gave sort of competing talks at a little workshop at Northeastern on foundations of quantum mechanics. I gave the Everettian spiel. He gave his Bohmian, et cetera, spiel. And I was celebrating the fact that, we had ways, we thought, to derive the existence of space just from the wave function. And his reaction was, I just have space in my ontology. It's right there. I don't need to derive it. And it's interesting because I think it's good that we can derive it from something more fundamental. He thinks it's good that it's just there. He doesn't need to worry about it, and it's right there. So who knows who will turn out to be correct in the end. Just so it's clear, because I don't like to push my own agenda too much on the podcasts, but I am not a fan of Bohmian mechanics. Like Tim thinks about Everett, I think that Bohm is a perfectly respectable try. It's absolutely worth considering, but I do think that those difficulties we touched on in fitting modern quantum field theory into the Bohmian framework are very, very big difficulties. I mean, you'll get very few particle physicists, quantum gravity people who are Bohmian people. There's a lot of Bohmian people out there, but they're mostly either in sort of quantum information type things or even more in philosophy of physics. John Bell was a Bohmian because he liked the fact that it was very, very clear and crisp and you knew what was happening. You knew your way around. It wasn't vague and hard to understand like Copenhagen was. So I think Everett's the way to go, but I'm very glad that people like Tim are working on the alternatives.